Okay, perfect. Well, we'll get started here, kind of kick things off. Thanks for coming, everybody. Appreciate you taking some time out of your Friday to drop into this workshop and learn a little something about data backups. This month, we're joined by Alex Piper from Dropsuite. Alex is a solutions consultant with proven success in enterprise account management, new logo acquisition, as well as business development and public speaking. So I'll kind of turn things over to her and let her introduce herself a little bit, but we'll get things started.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys. Like Damian said, I'm Alex Piper. I know you may have mentioned Dropsuite. I'm actually with Pax8, but Dropsuite is one of the vendors on our line card, just with respect to kind of what's offered. But from an actual solution standpoint, I've been working with Silicon Plains really just to help establish a backup strategy and help kind of let you guys know really just the value of what backup looks like, how to back your data up, where the information needs to be stored, thinking about compliance, what types of industries do you guys support, and then really just understanding how vulnerable is your data. Are you aware that, even as a small customer, you could still be just as vulnerable as a huge customer? I know we saw some stuff happen in current events this week, but really just an open discussion. And then the last portion of what I'd like to present on is more around how easy it is to adopt a backup solution. And then leveraging a service provider like Silicon Plains, all of the work is done for you. So it's always nice to have someone on your team, especially assisting around data vulnerability. So we'll just kind of get started. And I'd like for this to be interactive. So if there's anything that I say that poses questions, feel free to interrupt me. I don't think this will take too long, but we'll open it up at the end as well for questions. And if there's anything that's concerning that you'd like to talk about specifically with respect to your own business, by all means, please feel free to chime in. So thank you guys for joining. As part of, just really understanding backup, I think there's a pretty large perception gap around the risk of data loss. So, the saying, you don't know what you've got until it's gone, is pretty apparent with respect to most of life. But it can be hard as a smaller customer, even as a larger customer, to really see how valuable and vulnerable your data is until a crisis situation occurs, whether it's a natural disaster, something gets deleted because of human error, bad actors, ransomware attacks, things like that. And it's often really difficult to get your data back if it's been compromised and you don't have an offsite location or some sort of local backup across email data, workstation data, server data. It really just runs the gamut across every single vertical that exists out there in the world. But one of the benefits of offering a backup solution is that you know that all your data is secured. There's a lot of use cases where people think that they're too small. Maybe the data that we have is not important to a hacker. We'll never get hacked. We have a 5-person company. The chances of that happening are pretty high these days. I don't know if anyone saw in the news recently, but Caesar's Palace, billion-dollar company got hacked and paid a $15 million ransom to get their data back. Even the larger companies like that are seeing massive influxes of bad actors out there in the space. And a lot of that stemmed from COVID. I hate kind of referring back to those years, as I know it was a struggle for all of us, but you can also attribute things like the work from home shift. Maybe people aren't in their offices as much as they used to be. And there's a need for having systems that are multi-tenant that would allow an MSP like Silicon Plains to essentially manage a myriad of customers, just like yourselves, and know that your data is safe and supported. Just a couple stats, sometimes positioning backup products helps, just in a sense that there are data metrics out there that have kind of talked about this work from home shift. Ultimately, we can all think back to 2020. I used to work in an office, had to be in the office at 7 a.m. every day. You have your normal work hours, you've got a standing meeting, and you have a desk. There's a lot of collaboration when you work in an office, but then all of a sudden the world kind of shut down. So all kinds of factors like working outside of the safety of a corporate firewall, using multiple devices. I know for a fact I've got my personal email and my work email on my phone. My company has now instituted a policy where not only do we have 2FA, two-factor authentication with respect to Microsoft, since we use Microsoft Outlook, but we also have a password that either identifies our face or is using some sort of biometrics like a password in order to get into that. So there's lots of ways that bad actors can get in, kind of securing and making sure that backup is the last line of defense so that you can always get your data back is really helpful there. One crazy statistic that stood out to me, I know it's been a couple years since COVID, but around 2020, the FBI reported that cyber attack complaints were up by 400%. Microsoft, one of the leading productivity solutions in the world, reported that pandemic-themed phishing and social engineering attacks jumped by 10,000 a day. That is a massive number. And then the cybersecurity experts out there in the space that their sole job is adhering, to all of the compliances out there, 140-2, NIST, CIS controls, CGIS, anything like that. Ransomware attacks were up by 800%. And while we've seen a slight decrease in the total percentage, it's only created more opportunity for you as a customer and end user to think about why you would need to essentially back your data up. All of these businesses that decided not to back their stuff up essentially were kind of bruised in the process just because their security posture was weakened. Colliding with a flood of cyber attacks brought consequences of data loss to a lot of households as well as companies. So just some brief stuff, certainly not used to be a scare tactic, but it always is enlightening to hear statistics like that, at least for me. As far as
Alex,
yeah.
one thing before I forget, because I'm going to forget if I don't mention
it. Of course,
but it's just
absolutely,
an interesting factoid that while you're on the subject of facts. So the Caesar's Palace hack versus MGM hack, just as a side note, it was a fantastically smoking deal for Caesar's Palace to pay the fine. And so Caesar's Palace paid $15 million to get their data back. MGM lost $8 million a day.
Wow, I didn't even read that part. So
in lost revenue because they said they weren't going to pay it. I don't know what the number was. They never announced what their fee would have been to get their data back, but they were losing $8 million a day.
Yeah.
And the class action lawsuits have just started.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at the time that it took the hacker to actually get through, the entire operation was completed in less than 10 minutes.
Did you hear about how they did it?
Why don't you enlighten us? I'd love to hear from you.
So they exploited the help desk at MGM, called in and asked that multi-factor authentication be reset. And the help desk did it. So even though they had this incredible cybersecurity policy and everybody's supposed to have all these things and it's got to scan your tongue and take out your eyeball and measure it and all these things, it didn't matter because somebody called into the help desk and phished him and got him to reset multi-factor.
Crazy. So just right there, I mean, it doesn't matter how small or large your data is. There are bad actors everywhere. And ultimately, there's so many solutions out there that are procurable through Silicon Plains, other MSPs in the space just like that I work with daily, that essentially allow you guys to sleep at night because they come up with a solution stack. So one of the things I really wanted to go through a little bit further is really just explaining the vulnerability of data. We've talked about this 100 times, but businesses of all size are pretty much under siege from an increasing volume and variety of cyber attacks. Outside of just cyber attacks, though, you can think about malicious employees. I know, it is very common for me to hear user error, accidental file deletion. I know for a fact, I accidentally deleted my entire email mailbox about 3 years ago. And because my company was using an email backup solution, I was able to restore over 40,000 emails with a couple clicks of a button that automatically routed them back to the existing file path that I had, inbox, subfolder, XYZ, down to where I needed to go. Granted, it took a couple days just because of bandwidth and the number of files that I had, but I wasn't without the information. I knew I was going to get it back. One thing that, to think about as well is, do you have employee turnover? Are there people leaving your company regularly? I work with a lot of companies that are, I wouldn't call it churn and burn, but they have a lot of turnover. Maybe they hire a series of staff for a couple months while they onboard a certain project. That happens in consulting firms, that happens in legal firms, accounting firms. Maybe you hire somebody to come in during tax season. Well-meaning departing employees sometimes try to clean their devices and file systems before leaving, especially if they work on big projects or that would be comparable to something they're working on before that they need to use as an example. If you have something as simple as an email backup, which would back up the entire M365 environment or Google environment, you've got access to SharePoint, OneDrive, calendars, contacts, tasks, Teams channels, which you guys use to communicate internally, as well as the email data that is running on an incremental backup schedule that is as simple as using the customer's Microsoft Global Admin creds on the MSP side, which is what Silicon Plains would do on your behalf, and syncing that up to where all of the existing mail data gets pulled into a backup solution to allow you to be able to either download files out if you need to be able to provide that data to a specific employee while still retaining a backup of it. You can prevent end users from accessing data. So if somebody tries to go in and maybe they delete their entire inbox, you know that the solution is run a backup on the back end. Many of the solutions that are out there either run every 2 hours, every 8 hours. Sometimes they allow you to set the incremental backup schedule how you'd like to. But just kind of knowing that you have an MSP, a managed service provider like Silicon Plains in your back pocket should you need anything, in my opinion, provides quite a bit of peace of mind. And that's not just talking backup. It's talking security. It's talking infrastructure, which is Microsoft's cloud. It's talking productivity. Maybe you resell QuickBooks. Maybe you resell Microsoft. It's all, or utilize, I should say, Microsoft or any of that data. But there's all kinds of easy ways that are very nominal costs to prevent a massive influx of data loss. So pretty straightforward. One thing that comes up a lot in our industry are a couple acronyms: recovery time objective, which is RTO, and recovery point objective, which is RPO. Just to give you guys a brief definition of this in case anyone hasn't heard these terms before, the RTO, recovery time objective, is basically the targeted duration of time between the event of a failure and the point when operations are resuming, basically. And then recovery point objective is the maximum length of time permitted that data can be restored from, which may or may not mean data loss. So really all you're saying is RPO is the time from the last backup until the incident occurs that may have caused data loss. And that's always in parentheses just because you're not totally sure if you lost any data. If you've got a backup solution in place, you know you hadn't lost it. And then RTO is the time that you need or the time that you set to recover the lost data. So a big thing that comes up in a lot of areas is disaster recovery planning. You probably don't think that your Exchange server or your file server is going to go down. Maybe it's because you're using Microsoft and you think your data is safe in the cloud. It's not. You essentially have to determine your organization's tolerance for data loss and recovery time. So one of the resources that Damien and I have spoken about in the past is the cost of downtime calculator. Taking a look at your CapEx expenses, your OpEx expenses, what your recurring monthly revenue is, and then what it would look like over the course of 1 hour of downtime in the event that you got hit by a hurricane. You live in a disaster-prone area. Somebody deleted the data. The server crapped out. You name it, the disaster still exists. When you can accurately point or paint a picture of what the data loss looks like from a monetary standpoint, it makes a heck of a lot more sense on why you would need a backup solution. For what you'd pay on a monthly rate or an annual rate, depending on what contracts look like with vendors, it's a fraction of the cost. And as Dan pointed out, MGM lost $8 million a day until they got this figured out. And, I would love to be in a spot where I could lose $8 million a day, but most people aren't. It's just not realistic to look at that. So I really just wanted to go over those terms so that you would consider two questions. How long will it take to bring an environment online once a disaster or major incident is declared? And then how much downtime is acceptable? And have we quantified the cost of the acceptable downtime on a per application basis? So essentially you are weighing the options on the front end of what your business could withstand. If you choose to forego it, you've done the exercise. You're kind of the opinion that I'm going to choose to move away from this because I don't feel like I need it. If the situation were to arise where you are presented with a backup option, my hope is that you choose to take it because it is the best route. You never know when your data is going to be compromised. I work in IT. It's been my job for years, and I still deleted my inbox. No idea how I did it, but things happen. it's never too late. And it's, the analogy of driving a car without car insurance, or, going bungee jumping without medical insurance, something like that. You probably just wouldn't do it. It's the same exact thing when it comes to running your business. Do you have a viable backup solution in place from a solution stack standpoint, which we'll get into in just a second, of providing an email backup? If you guys are using emails to exchange, perhaps you are selling your services, you need to communicate with the end user. Do you have a workstation backup? Is there proprietary data on a customer or an end user's laptop? Do you need to be able to access that data? What if I go to China on vacation and all of my data is hosted in the cloud and I leave my laptop in China? Well, the benefit of that is I can get a brand new laptop, and because I've got a backup solution on it, all of that data can be restored down from the cloud, and all I have to do is enter in a couple of passwords and my machine is up and running with the exact same operating system it was using before. That is a very easy process. And I know for a fact from working with both Dan and Damien, that's something they'll handle on your behalf. It's white glove treatment. It's all based off of what they can do to meet your needs as a customer. They support all kinds of different verticals, so there's no task that's, not doable for them. Really, just having these conversations with a group like Silicon Plains really makes a difference for you guys, just because it allows you a little bit more peace of mind in terms of what you actually have to back up. So
it really does. One of the things about those cost of downtime calculators, and maybe the ones that you've seen cover this as well, but our experience has been that for a lot of the clients that aren't necessarily regulated heavily to where they're being audited as to whether or not their backups are good enough, and which is most, aren't getting audited like that. The majority of them kind of get by with, we hope we've got a good solution, or we hope, that Silicon Plains knows what they're doing, or whoever the IT provider at the moment happens to be. But one of the costs that we see that a lot of times exceeds whatever someone thought the monetary would be was the reputation destruction. If the word gets out that you can't even handle deleting data and getting it back, there is a trust factor that your clients have with you. And we've seen that with the businesses who've lost data in the past, where it's damaged so heavily that they're not interested in doing business with you going forward, because it doesn't even look like you have the basics covered.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to our thought process around why you would create a managed solution stack. A lot of times there's a heavy security focus. What I'd like to change the perception around is security, infrastructure, productivity, all of those combined add into what we call a business continuity strategy. How do we maintain every vector of our business, from the application software that we use to do billing, from anything that's hosted in the cloud? You would want to look at antivirus, you'd want to look at DNS filtering. All of these vectors come in the exact same way backup comes in. You hear, I'm sure we've all heard of Norton, or we've all heard of other products like that, McAfee, things like that. People hear those names and it rings a bell. That's a protection software. I'd like to change the narrative a little bit and allow you guys to feel more comfortable discussing options like backup in the same line of sight that you would use to discuss security. So if you have a layered approach to security, email filtering, antivirus protection, web protection, all these different layers, backup operates the same way. Email backup, endpoint backup, disaster recovery, high availability. It is pretty uncommon that anybody would need high availability unless you're a major hospital conglomerate where you need close to near instant data recovery. If machines are running or something like that that's saving someone's life, you probably need to be able to flip a switch and have everything keep working. But there are a lot of very cost-effective ways to go about backup and disaster recovery. So I'd ask that you think about where you guys live geographically. I would ask, are you prone? Do you live in Florida? Do you live in coastal areas that are prone to hurricanes? I was talking with my brother who lives in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he owns a moving company. And so they've got point of sale systems. They have all kinds of CRM tools that they use to track moves. And one of them went down. And I'm his sister who has gone over backup needs. This is what I do for a living. And he still didn't do it. And he's calling me in a panic thinking, how do we get this back? And so they ultimately had to pay. It wasn't because of a ransomware, it was their server crashed. They couldn't get a lot of that historical data back. And so it really plays into, do I really have this risk tolerance set up to where my risk tolerance is zero because I have these backup solutions? Or am I even more vulnerable than I thought I was because I never actually weighed the pros and cons here? So that's, a very short kind of explanation of a general overview of what backup does. But really the one thing I wanted to incentivize is both Dan and Damien have been extremely helpful for me throughout this whole process. And I know for you guys as well, just being able to sleep a little bit better at night, knowing you have a team behind you that is willing to put forth the effort, that goes through the controls on the back end, that studies the frameworks around security and, preventing any kind of cyber attack. For me, that provides quite a bit of peace of mind knowing you don't have to do it by yourself. So I'm going to pause.
I hope, Alex, when this incident happened with your brother, that you made sure to tell him that you, if you weren't before, were absolutely the smartest of all the siblings now.
I said I told you so.
There you go.
No, it was a rough day for him. It wasn't too detrimental, but he kind of called and was like, how do I get my foot in the door here? So,
you didn't feel like punching him in the nose with that information on the same day he called?
My company, I did what I needed to do. And so it's, but it's a conversation. That's in my own family that happened. I gave you the example about me deleting my own inbox. I would consider myself a pretty smart person, and I still made a mistake. It happens all the time. So
yeah, absolutely.
I hope this was helpful. I know it was a fairly short webinar, but I'd really like to turn it over for any of the guests on the call. If you guys have any additional questions you'd like to ask or bring up anything specific that Dan or Damien could help answer.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple of questions here kind of in the Q&A section. And so I guess the first one was, where do you really see the future of data backups going? There's a ton of information right there now about, everything moving to the cloud. And at the same time, there's all kinds of information out there about, attacks escalating on the cloud. Yeah. I mean, what's kind of your opinion on where you see that future going?
It's kind of 6 in one, half a dozen in the other, and it all depends on what you're looking to back up. So I can give you a couple of examples. Me personally, I would recommend a cloud first approach. Install an agent on a protected system, push the data to a cloud, have the ability to host your data or virtualize it in the cloud, essentially through some sort of site-to-site open VPN connection. However, what if you support architectural firms, or what if you are an architectural firm with hundreds of terabytes of CAD data? Some of it may not be mission critical data. So really establishing on your end, what is mission critical and what is not? What do I need to have a couple backups of? And that really adheres to that 3-2-1 backup rule. You've got a couple copies on site. You have a copy off site. And really that kind of opens up a whole can of worms there, Damien, just with respect to, there is nothing wrong with offering a local backup. If you have employees that are in an office that never work from home, that connect to a local backup, which would then connect to a file server or the Exchange server that's running those desktops, that's a fine method. However, if you think about where we all are now, I'm sitting at my house right now. My office is in Denver. We use an appliance-based backup solution and a cloud-based backup solution for those remote workers that work anywhere in the world. So while there are GDPR requirements for a lot of companies, your data must be stored in the United States, is what I was talking about. Many of the vendors that exist out there offer geo-redundant backups so that you can utilize backups in other countries. You could have a team of staff in EMEA, you could have one in Europe, and all access the same data from one machine in a multi-tenant dashboard, which is essentially what Damien and Dan would be doing on behalf of you guys. So really understanding, my personal opinion, I think the future is going directly to the cloud. By removing on-prem infrastructure, you reduce overhead costs. There's no servicing. You don't have to get a new device in a couple years. But it's really dependent on the customer. So that's where you guys come into play, is evaluating what is mission critical on your machines. It's a helpful exercise to go through anyways, because it kind of shows you where you could be compromised. Just like I was talking about with my brother, the point of sale system was what went down. That is how they do all of their billing. They cannot get paid by their customers if they don't have a secure billing system. So, through a backup of that, many of them, there's QuickBooks Online backup, there's email backup, there's server backup. You could back up file shares, pretty much anything you want to, through a determined path set by a backup solution that is just a couple of clicks away from someone like Silicon Plains. All they're asking you to do is give your buy-in and approval so that ultimately they can help manage the data on the back end. And if you guys do need recovery of files, you don't have to do it on your own. You can have somebody else export all that data for you. We'll do the back end work.
Yeah, that's somebody else's statement is mission critical to making sure people understand, who are watching the webinar, that our role really is to make it so that the client doesn't have to go through every file, every folder, every system. That's our job. We'll do that upfront analysis, and we'll probably take some sort of multi-layered approach, like you mentioned before, Alex, and make sure that this data is backed up someplace that makes sense. So, and by make sense, as an example, we had have a client who needed, apparently to them, terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data backed up, just an extreme amount of data. And after we did our analysis, we found out that every song that had ever existed since the beginning of time, and someone's grandpa had been using LimeWire like back in the 1800s to download every MP3 ever. And it was all sitting on this one machine that they thought was contributing to their total backup requirement for how much data they needed to be pushing into the cloud. And it took it from, I think, something in the neighborhood of 4 terabytes down to about 100 gigabytes. So super manageable. Costs dropped down through the floor to something. And that was our team that figured out, hey, do you really need to have this stuff backed up? And that analysis helped us, go to them, present our findings, and they said, whoops. And we ended up just putting all of that on a hard drive that they stuck on a shelf someplace. And maybe someday they'll go back to it. But then now they know that the data they've got is easily backed up. It's always there. We only had to have one system. There didn't need to be a truck to transport it all someplace because there was so much of it. And that's our role in all of this, is to bring the expertise to the table, do the analysis, figure out the solution, present it. And like you said, Alex, give the client the opportunity to say that makes sense to me. Not only is it, going to back everything up, but it's affordable, and let's move forward. And then we're backed up by a company like yours with people like you, giving us access to whatever solutions it is that we need to move forward with to do exactly what the client expects if they do have a failure.
Awesome. Cool.
Perfect.
What were
And
the
the
other
last-
questions?
The last question here for you would be, what is the number one thing that you hope people took away from this webinar? There was one.
That you're
That's
better
a
than
great-
your brother. That's what I got out of it.
Great point. I think the number one thing is really just analyzing how risky you guys can be and how valuable your data is. That's really a twofold thing, but understanding how valuable your data is so that in the event that there is a data loss, can you actually keep your business afloat? If you can't, if you've got leverage like MGM, paying $8 million out a day, I commend you. That's awesome. I still think you need a backup solution, but those are the biggest things, is really getting in a frame of mind to think about how vulnerable your data is. Those recovery point and recovery time objectives. How much time do you have if a disaster hits before your business goes away? And then can you get your data back? So it's just revisiting those things. If you're using a backup solution currently, I'm glad. Thank you. Makes my job easier. If you're not, there are a number of solutions out there that I know both Damien and Dan are very familiar with. I've worked with them with other customers on this, and it's gone flawless. It's very, very easy process. So between the three of us, there's always room for questions. If anything comes up, Damien and Dan both have my contact information. More than happy to have a conversation about any of this stuff. The door is always open, and there's a lot that I didn't know when I first started working in the backup space. So certainly no hard feelings if any of this stuff is new. If it's not in your purview, you probably don't think about it. And that's where most of the world is, unfortunately. But that's where we're looking to shift to. So.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
Well, on that note, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Alex. I know that was incredibly insightful, and I know everybody took a lot of good information away. Just a quick reminder that we're going to have another workshop here Monday, October 16th, same time, noon Central, 11 a.m. Mountain, on cybersecurity. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a nice rest of your week.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much for listening.
Thanks,
Have
everybody.
a good weekend, y'all. Bye-bye.
See you, Alex.